special this morning for you to get to hear, because there is so much wisdom that resides in our homes. So much wisdom that gets conveyed to children and to family members as they're grown that never sees the light of day other than in the light of those to whom it's said. And we can all benefit from that. And so this morning, we're going to read some of these. Oh, thank you very much. Oh my goodness. Okay. Don't say that too loudly. I mean, they may applaud. Sherry said I might not get to preach. You want to go first, or you want me to? Yeah, we're just going to. And some of these have signatures to them, and some don't. And so we will proceed. Okay.
I like this one. How to take a punch and be nice.
Yes, it is.
I
think it's called turning the other cheek, isn't it? Yeah. My mother taught me to love and learn from my fellow man. She taught me to love God and to serve Him. I miss her presence very much. Well, those are big lessons right there.
My mom taught me to take everything to the Lord in prayer.
This is a very personal decision here. Someone is saying that his or her, I'm not sure who it might be, but their mom was significant in helping them make a life-changing decision. And that through the guidance that the mother offered, that was able to help that person make a very transitional decision in their life.
Taught me to be patient. That's kind of like turning the other cheek. Also.
Yeah, that's a big lesson. Sometimes the best lessons learned are what not to do. I've learned a lot in that regard. I am thankful for what I've learned. I love my mother no matter what. Boy, isn't that the truth? How many of you are glad that you grew up in a home where the parents didn't fight? You know, where there weren't arguments and knockdown, drag-out battles.
Mom taught to seek the Lord, to seek the kingdom of God, faith, worship God in spirit and truth.
Here's one, I believe, from Mark. Patience in the midst of many children and multitudes of grandchildren. How many moms would say, thank God, bless that woman, you know? Could we sit and talk for a while? Yeah.
Just simple. My mother loved me. And that is the truth. Bottom line.
From Mary Catlett, my mother taught me always to take time for children. Yeah.
She taught me how to cook. That's a good one.
And her husband said, God bless you.
And she helped me read the Bible.
My mother taught me how to respect others, to love, care, cook, clean house, go to church, and be responsible for myself. Wow. Mary Escamilla. James, you're a lucky man.
She taught me how to work hard and make fried potatoes.
Oh yeah, made me what I am today. My mother taught me how to respect myself and others, from Lorenzo. That's great.
Don't talk back. Respect your elders. How to... I'm not sure.
How to ring one's ear to get attention. Is that right, Vern? Oh. Can I tell you a story about that? We were, this is not about Vernon, this is about, speaking of that, we were in Groveland and we were taking a little tour around Pine Mountain Lake. And there was a young man who was being particularly difficult. And his grandmother had said, "Do not get off this boat." And he proceeded to do just what she had told him not to do. Now he's about 12 or 13 years old. And the next thing you see is his grandmother exiting the boat and returning with this little boy by the ear and encouraging him to return to the boat. And the guy that was the little captain of the boat that day said, he had this very deep bass voice, he said, "May her tribe increase." He said it kind of under his breath, so that no one would really hear it, and yet we all were close enough we could hear it. That's very good. James Escamilla says, "My mother taught me how to work and clean up after myself and others, also to learn to respect elders and go to church." How many wives here this morning would say, thank God for a mom that teaches her son how to clean up after himself and how to work?
Sylvia says, "My mother has taught me the importance of keeping family together. My mother helped me come to the Lord and continues to guide me with godly advice."
There's one that's unsigned, but what a great lesson to learn. Always be gracious. Always be gracious. Wow.
My mom taught me how to be selfless as a parent and how to be content in all situations and give praise to the Lord in all of life's circumstances. That's huge.
To always think of the good things in your life, no matter how bad some things get. That'll be important in light of my message this morning.
Trust, love, joy, and happiness.
My mom taught me to give my elders the respect they are due. She also taught me manners and how to be respectable in public.
I learned from my mom that life is unexpected, the when, where, and how, but we must trust in God to help us through our lives. Not to eat pork when it's hot and lose weight.
There's the makings of a book right there. From Charles Gustafson. "Be kind to others because they are more likely to be friendly back, and it's the best way to be. It keeps people happy." Boy, is that true. Thank you, John.
My mother taught me how to live frugally. She taught me to be responsible and honest.
Simply put, my mother taught me to be honest.
Work should never be more important than your children and family.
My mother always taught me no matter what, things could always be worse. Boy, isn't that the truth? And would say, "I cried because I had no shoes until I met a man who had no feet." Also, God plus one makes a majority. Thanks, Mom.
Mary Inman. My mother was the most honest person. Telling the truth was so important to her, and she lived her beliefs in front of me. That is so true. I've talked with Chuck about it. I see people that are at work, and they kind of shade the truth, and so then you don't know, are they telling me the truth this time or are they not? So that's a very important.
From Courtney, to love someone even though they've done wrong.
I learned about time travel. She said if I didn't behave, she'd knock me into next week. Unsigned.
We may have to edit that for the internet, Gary. We might be good. Be nice to people and to love the Lord.
My wonderful mommy taught me to love no matter what. Michelle.
How to nurture, to mature and be respectful and to do my chores right and to act like an adult. Wow. How many of you work with somebody that you wish their parents had taught them to act like an adult? Any more? What did you learn? What was the most important lesson you learned from your mom?
I think two things I'll say real quickly. Perseverance, stick to it. I watched her, she raised 5 kids. We were in music ministry. Every weekend we were hitting the road, going somewhere. And she had 5 kids to get ready, clothes and all that stuff, and she did it weekly. Even though they weren't pastors, but they felt called to the ministry. And that was, I think that was a huge lesson for me in learning what ministry was all about. But the second thing was, I was saved as a young child in children's church. And I just remember, I don't remember the date, I don't remember anything of that, but I remembered that, wow, saying, he died for me. But then, after I got to be old, like 10 years old, I started doubting, and I remember hearing them talk about Jesus is coming, and I got afraid. And I just remember finally opening up to my mom and saying, I'm just afraid. And she said, well, did you give your heart to Jesus? Yes. Then you don't have anything to be afraid of. And that just has so impressed me that don't be afraid. Once you've made that decision and you continue to love Him, you're good.
Well, I have the unique privilege of being able to say this in front of my mom today. And that's, Mom, thank you for teaching me to love God with all my heart. And that's the most important thing a person can do in this life. Thank you. We're going to dismiss our children for Children's Church. Sorry, Sarah, to keep them a little longer today. Open your Bibles with me, if you will, to the book of Ruth. I don't know that I've ever spoken from the book of Ruth before. And most of the time when people speak from the book of Ruth, they speak about Ruth. But today I want to talk with you about the book of Ruth from Naomi's standpoint. Not Naomi Mitchell, but Naomi, the wife of Elimelech, and the mother of Chilion and Mahlon, and the mother-in-law of Ruth and Orpah. The story of Ruth is really a tragic one because it deals with a woman who essentially loses everything. Read the first 5 verses with me of chapter 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech. His wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. And after they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Somebody tell me why that's important. She did not have anyone to take care of her. She was living in a foreign land, and she had no one who was going to watch out after her well-being. And so after they had, we don't really know after the 2 sons passed, we don't really know how long Naomi continued to live in the land of Moab, which, by the way, Moab is the country where the sons of Lot, by one of his daughters, the incestuous relationship he had with one of his daughters, Moab, is the country in which they lived. So probably wasn't a real great spiritual environment for them to be living in, if that's any indicator of the kind of people that they were, which typically they were at odds with the people of Israel. There was always some kind of conflict that was going on with them. We don't know how long that that Naomi and Orpah and Ruth continued to live in Moab. But word came to Naomi that the conditions in Judah had turned, and that the famine or the difficult time that had been going on, that had reversed, and now they were beginning to see more prosperous times. And so Naomi decided it was time for her to say goodbye to her daughters and return to her home. The unstated issue in the book is this. Naomi had come to the end of her life with no one to care for her. We don't know how old she is, but we do know that her sons were old enough to be adult men who were married and potentially could have had their own families. So it's probably not unreasonable for us to assume that Ruth was somewhere in the 50 to 60 year old age bracket. Not that that's super old by today's standards, but in those days it was a person advancing in years. And given the difficult nature of labor in those days, it made it difficult for Naomi to have any kind of care in her life. And so there really wasn't anything for her to do but to go home and to depend on the benevolence of the people who were going to be there when she returned. Now, one of the interesting things that happened in the nation of Israel is that when the inherited property was given, a family would never lose its inheritance. The way things were structured, they could never permanently sell their land to someone else. They could sell it to someone within the family, and then they could redeem it back from that person. But they could never, like we would do today, if we fall on hard times and we have a lot of property to sell, we would have to liquidate our assets and then just kind of be out on our own, living on the streets or whatever the circumstances might be. So Naomi did have the opportunity to return to her homeland and that she would have a place to live, but as far as how she was going to be cared for, who was going to work the fields and all of that, there really wasn't any prospects for her. How many of you know that sometimes life doesn't turn out as you plan? I don't think that there's by any stretch of the imagination, that Naomi expected to be in this case, or in this circumstance. She had 2 sons. Most families were thrilled if they had 1, because it virtually ensured that the family line would continue, and it virtually ensured that there would be someone to take care of the older parents as they continued to age and were not able to care for themselves. So at some point, Naomi thought, well, I'm in pretty good shape here. You know, I've got 2 sons. I may not be living in my homeland, but I've got 2 sons, and they have wives. And so somewhere along the line, there's going to be a child that will be born, and there will be someone who will be able to take care of me since my husband has passed away at an early age. It's interesting, though, Naomi's perspective on this. Naomi is a beautiful Hebrew name, and it literally means pleasant. There must have been something about her, because in those days, typically, people would name children for a characteristic that the child possessed, or some kind of divine purpose in their lives. And Naomi was identified with this idea of pleasantness. But when she returned to her homeland, she said this: "Don't call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara." Mara is the Hebrew word for bitter. She said, "My life has taken a horrible turn." And she began to feel like maybe some of us feel at times. She said, "The Lord is against me. The Lord is not for me. The Lord is against me." And now, my life, instead of being a pleasant place, my life is a bitter place. What do you do when your life becomes a bitter place? How do you deal with the circumstances and the situations that you find around you? Naomi really becomes an object lesson to us, a study for us as we look at how you and I can deal with things that come to our lives. We all come to these places. Now, maybe not as tragically as Naomi, but maybe you don't get the job promotion that you're looking for. Maybe your children fail you in some way. Maybe your spouse fails you in some way. Maybe you develop an illness that you hadn't anticipated. And maybe it's not bad enough that it's going to take your life, but it's sure going to alter the way that you live. And it's going to make you be a different person. It's very easy for us to become bitter. It's very easy for us to look as though God has judged us in some way and that God is mad at you. And that's what we see happening with Naomi. And isn't it interesting that someone who's so pleasant can be turned into someone who feels that God himself has turned his back on her? Now, how many have ever met someone like that? It's a sad story, isn't it? So what do? I want you, and we're going to have to move quickly here this morning. But I want you to see some things that Naomi did. And the first thing that she did was actually before all of the bad stuff started happening in her life. The first thing that Naomi did, and it was a part of her life, and maybe it was why people saw her as a pleasant person, she invested in people. She invested herself in other people. Living in a foreign land with daughters-in-law from a different culture, Naomi invested in these two daughters-in-law. It's not by chance that when it came time for Naomi to return to Judah, that both of the daughters did not want to leave her. She couldn't do anything for them. They weren't hanging with her because they could get something out of her. She couldn't do anything for them. But they didn't want to leave Naomi. Now, one did ultimately go, and it was her right to do that. She had the privilege of leaving to go home. But the greater portion of the rest of the book of Ruth is about the one daughter-in-law who didn't return home. Her name was Ruth. These two ladies, these two daughters-in-law, came from a completely different culture. Can you imagine how different they were from Naomi? And their gods were different. Their cultural habits were very likely different. And of course, we all know the stories that come from in-laws. That in and of itself can be a challenge. I had a gentleman was talking with me just recently. And it was what he was telling me about the struggles with his in-laws is so outside my paradigm. It just doesn't fit my experience. He was telling me that he and his wife do not get an invitation to Thanksgiving dinner when it's held at his son's house because they don't get along with his daughter. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness. And people live with that. I mean, this has been for years. So the potential for division and difficulty with Naomi and her daughters-in-law is an amazing one. But I want you to listen to what her daughter-in-law Ruth says to her. Look at verse 16 of chapter 1. Now this is after Naomi has attempted and persuaded and said, don't stay with me. There's no reason for you to stay with me. I can't do anything for you. Listen to what Ruth says. Don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. And that's pretty big right up to that point, right? But I want you to listen to what I noticed this as I was studying this week. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord deal with me, be it ever so severely, if even death separates me from you. Think of that. She said, I am so bonded to you at a heart level that even when we die, there is going to be the living on of the memory of the relationship that existed between Naomi and Ruth. These ladies had become connected to one another in a remarkable way. Not only was Ruth willing to be connected with Naomi, she was willing to leave her people, she was willing to leave behind her gods, she was willing to die with Naomi, and she was willing that she would not let anything separate them from one another. Here's the interesting thing. Naomi had no idea when she was making the investment in Ruth, she had no idea that one day this circumstance would come around. She wasn't investing in Ruth so that at some future day she could get something out of her. She was just investing in Ruth. And what a remarkable return on her investment she received, as you find out when you read on in the story, because Ruth really becomes a link to Naomi's salvation in terms of having someone to care for her as her life unfolds. So when life doesn't turn out the way you want it to be, even before life doesn't turn out the way you want it to be, the first thing we need to do is begin making investments in people. Pour yourself into folks. Obviously, that begins with family. The biggest investment any of us can make is in our families, in our children, in our spouses. Spouse, you only have one. To me this week, I told you last Sunday we were at district council, and the last service at district council every year is an ordination service, where new ministerial candidates are ordained to the ministry. And as one of the leaders of our district, I have the privilege of what we call laying on of hands, the prayer of anointing for someone going into ministry. And this year I had the privilege of praying for a young man who had been in our church in Groveland, who has since gone through the training to become a minister and now is serving a church in Sacramento. And it was a wonderfully special moment for me. But at one point during the evening, he turned around to me and he said, you know, you told me one time that if I can do anything else and be happy, that I should do it. And he said, I tried insurance, and I tried golf. He is an excellent golfer. And he said, that wasn't where it was at. And he said, so it was about the ministry. And he looked at me and he said, Pastor, it all began with you. You want to talk about making a person's life? It was more than a day. See, we make investments in people when we don't think we're making investments in people. I didn't even remember the conversation I had with him in specifics, but he did. And there's somebody that's remembering the investment that you're making in them. Yesterday we at Compassion had the privilege to talk to a man who has been coming for a few weeks. His name is Robert, and quite a capable poet. And he said to me, I go to all the parks and I collect all the food I can collect. And he said, I'm sorry, but I don't care. I don't care about that. That's not why we do what we do. Here's what he said to us. He said, I come here. And he said, all the other places, they serve us, they give us stuff. But he said, they all act like it's a chore. He said, when I come here, you folks care for me. See, that's an investment. That's an investment. And when we make those kinds of investments in people, we do it because it's the right thing to do. Naomi did it, and in her particular situation, it produced something down the road that she did not even anticipate. The second thing that you have to do is you learn to trust the grace of God. when Naomi and Ruth go back to Judah. Look at chapter 2, verse 2. They get back to Judah, and they've been living there for a while, and they're trying to figure out what they're going to do. And one morning, Ruth, in verse 2, says this, Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Favor is another word that refers to grace. She said, "I want to go out into the fields, and whoever will be gracious enough to me to let me come along behind and to glean, to do what they call gleaning," she said, we'll trust that. Now, you know what the remarkable thing is? She didn't know that she ended up in the fields of the guy that was a close relative of Naomi, and that ultimately that guy was going to be the guy that marries Ruth and becomes the protector of Naomi in her latter years. Does that make sense? Did I say that in a way that makes sense to you? Okay? Folks, you and I can trust the grace of God. We can trust the grace of God. God wants to do good to you. Now, did Ruth have to go out in the fields and work? Absolutely she did. God didn't come along and drop it in her lap. Although grace sometimes causes that to happen. But she went out, and God's favor went with her, and she not only found a place where she could get food, but the place where she got the food was with the person with whom she would be married and spend the rest of her life. Didn't know it at the time. When bitterness comes, God's grace is still available to us. And as a matter of fact, it's the grace of God that's going to help you overcome the bitter circumstances that you find yourself in. You and I cannot work hard enough to work ourselves out of those situations. But God's grace comes to us. The third thing I want you to see is don't focus on yourself and your bitterness. Chapter 3, verse 1. Here's what Naomi says to Ruth. One day Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, "My daughter, I must find a home for you where you will be well provided for." Well, wait a minute. Naomi didn't have anybody to provide for her. Naomi didn't have anyone who was taking care of her. And yet what's she doing? She's not focusing on what her own circumstances are. She's saying, "Ruth, I've got to get you into a good home. I've got to find a place for you where someone will take care of you." And in the middle of her own struggle and difficulty, what's her concern? That Ruth will be taken care of. Folks, there's way too many times when we find ourselves walking through difficult circumstances that all we can see is what they have done to me. And we rehearse it, and we rehearse it, and all somebody has to do is hint at the story, and you can give them the full, illustrated, unedited version. And what we see in Naomi is she is focused on Ruth and on what Ruth needed in her life. And it kept Naomi from becoming focused only on her own needs. The fourth thing that I want you to see is that you can trust God to redeem your situation. Turn to chapter 4. The way the story unfolds, Ruth works in the fields of a man by the name of Boaz. Boaz is a relative of Naomi's. And the way the Israelite culture was arranged, when a person like Naomi fell on hard times, one of their relatives could help them out of the situation by temporarily buying their property so that they would have enough money to be able to take care of themselves. Okay? And so Boaz was a relative of Naomi's who could do that kind of thing. They had to be what they called a near kinsman, or a close relative. Not just somebody at a distance could do it, but a close relative could do it. Now, there was another relative to Naomi that was a little bit more closely related than Boaz, and so he had to be given the first right of refusal. And so they went through that process, and this gentleman said, you know what, I'll buy the property. And Boaz said, well, I need to tell you there's one more detail. You got to marry Ruth if you're going to buy the property. And he said, well, I can't do that, so you can buy the property. So Boaz ends up buying the property and marrying Ruth. And they begin to have a family together. So now here, I know I'm moving fast, but we're running out of time. So here's the way the story goes. Naomi and Ruth come back to Judah. They start working in the fields. The fields that they're working in is someone who is a relative who can help them with their financial difficulties. He chooses to do so, and part of the deal is that he has to marry Ruth in order to help them with their financial situation. That's the condensed version. Okay? They start to have a family, starting in verse 11 of chapter 4. Then the elders and all the people of the gate said, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. And basically they're saying, may the lady you're marrying have lots of kids. May you have standing in Ephratah and be famous in Bethlehem. This is just so how God works in redeeming the situation. Who are some of the famous people who were born in Bethlehem? Jesus, for one. Anybody else? David. May you have standing in Ephratah and be famous in Bethlehem. Boaz ends up being the great-grandfather of David. Boaz also ends up being the however many great-grandfathers, however many generations between Boaz and Jesus. He is a relative in Jesus' bloodline. May you be famous in Bethlehem. I think that's fairly famous, don't you? David and Jesus, that's pretty good people to have in your bloodline. But it goes on. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and when he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. The women said to Naomi, now remember, they're talking to Naomi. The women said to Naomi, praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a family guardian. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth. Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, what? What did they say? What did they say? Specifically, what did they say? Naomi has a son. Not Ruth. Naomi has a son. You want to talk about God taking a bitter situation and spinning that thing on its ear and turning it into something that is so incredibly gracious and life-begetting and life-giving. It's not Ruth who's the mother. They're talking about Naomi being blessed as a result of it. Trust God to redeem your situation. If we will allow Him, He will enter our circumstances, and He will be the Redeemer of whatever you and I find ourselves in. We do not have to resort to bitterness. We do not have to resort to the clamoring and the clatter that this world says we have to do in order to manage, but we can trust God to come into our circumstance and redeem our situation. And the whole community looks at it and they say, wow, God's really good to you. And they see the evidence of God's testimony in your life. Am I making sense to you this morning? How many of you are in a, don't raise your hands, but think with me. How many of you are in a place or have been in a place Or bitterness would be an easy thing for you to cultivate. Things haven't turned out like you expected. Things haven't been what you had hoped that they would be. Keep making the investments. Keep trusting the grace of God. Don't focus on what's going on in you. Look for ways to bless other people. And trust God to redeem your situation. Would you bow your heads with me?